Let's go!
Good morning, everybody. Vlog number 15. Let's talk triggers, shall we? In the context of binge eating disorder, there's two types of triggers. There's emotional triggers, and then there's the food triggers. Let's address the easy one first, and that would be the food triggers. So a trigger food is a food that, to quote Pringles, once you pop, you can't stop. Essentially, once you taste this food, it opens the floodgates to your binging. Back when I was still suffering, I think I had, it was more like a category of foods, not a single food. Salty and sweet things are, my favorite things still. If you guys follow me on Instagram, you know that. I love salty and sweet snacks and whatnot. But back then, I could not control myself. So trail mix was a big one for me. I loved trail mix, especially the kind with the M&Ms and the peanuts and the raisins. And I told you guys in that worst binge ever vlog about how I ate so much trail mix that I shit blood, because your body can only grind those nuts down, and it was basically like pooping gravel. So anyways, that was like that category of things. Chex Mix was another thing, the sweet and salty Chex Mix. Any kind of sweet and salty, peanut M&Ms, things like that, just, and if you read, I'm sure you figured this out by now, but 99% of the time, unless you're a special snowflake, your trigger food is not going to be a wholesome, nutrient-dense food. It's going to be usually junk. For all, trail mix is junk, guys. Don't fool yourself into thinking it's not. So those foods, taking them out of the equation is sometimes just a good rule for general health purposes, until you learn how to moderate your intake of those things, and until you learn until they're not trigger foods anymore. I can eat all the foods I mentioned in small quantities now, and I have no issues with it. And that's another thing. If you're thinking about reintroducing a trigger food as you recover, as you get deeper into your recovery, and the thought of eating that food causes you any sort of anxiety, even a little bit, I would highly suggest to not go there just yet, because if you're feeling anxious about that food, that means you are not recovered and not ready to bring those foods back into the fold. So, cliff notes, until you are well recovered for, I don't want to put a time frame on it, but you have to feel comfortable and have to be honest with yourself and say, I'm great, I feel good. I was probably a year or two, I didn't eat like a trail mix. I still don't eat trail mix very often, but it's just it's too calorie dense and it's a stupid food. But I could eat a handful of sweet and salty Chex Mix any day of the week. So, and once again, guys, it's not the end of the world if you eat a whole bag of sweet and salty Chex Mix. That's not binge eating disorder, because who hasn't done that? Let's be honest. The issue is that you start eating the sweet and salty Chex Mix, and before you know it, you're eating whole pizzas, entire containers, gallons of ice cream, 17 protein bars, things like that. That's another thing. I've binged on protein bars before, just because it was sweet and salty. Binge eating disorder is fucked up, man. All right, let's get on to the more complex side of things here. I'm not a professional, remember, so these are my opinions based on my experiences. The emotional trigger side is important. It's really important for your recovery to identify what your biggest triggers are in terms of emotions. Now, I would say loneliness is not an emotion; it's a state the state of loneliness and not being around anybody. That was my number one trigger. But I guess if we're talking about emotional triggers, the sadness that comes from being lonely was my biggest trigger. I don't think it's any coincidence that my two worst stretches of binge eating happened after breakups. So no, I don't think it's any coincidence at all. I'd say, I was dating somebody during my first hard bout, but I'd say that the reason I started binge eating, to be honest, full force, is that our relationship was dwindling. It wasn't going well, and I kind of saw the writing on the wall. And then you spend 5 years with somebody and they break up with you via text message. Well, You know, that's gonna, and if you're in a fragile state, that sends you into a downward spiral, and it did. The second time, my girlfriend picked me up from the airport. I had a really hard wrestling trip to Germany, because that's another thing. Look, I loved wrestling. I love professional wrestling with all my heart, but the loneliness on the road it ate me up, man. Because you're going, it's a lot of times, I mean, you're with people, but a lot of times you aren't. There's a lot of moments of, you know, where you're just sitting in an airport by yourself, or you're just sitting in a hotel room by yourself, and it's not healthy. It wasn't healthy for me, I mean. Some people love that, being alone all the time, but that wasn't my thing. So I come back from a hard road trip in Germany, get broken up with on the ride home, which I was dealing with depression at the time too, so that never helps. That sent me off the deep end. And, you know, my third bout after contest prep, I was single. And I was alone. I had moved back to Sarasota, my hometown, and I didn't know anybody. And I didn't have any social interaction at all. And I think that I filled that hole with food. And that's the thing, the trigger, we still at the end of the day have to realize that binge eating is a coping mechanism to cover up for whatever that trigger. You know, if you're lonely and sad from being lonely, fill the hole that's inside of you with food. If you get mad about something and you're pissed or whatever and you're frustrated, cover up that frustration and that anger with food. That's what we do. It's a coping mechanism. So I knew my biggest trigger was loneliness. So how do you fix that? That's easy. You surround yourself with friends and family. You put yourself into scenarios that might be uncomfortable for a person who isn't a social butterfly. And you're around people all the time. Because you know as well as I do, guys, I'm talking to you. You're hearing me right now. Nobody watching this video binges around other people. That's not the nature of the disease. It's a solo venture. We're ashamed of it. We're embarrassed, so we're gonna hide it. So it really depends on what your trigger is. But that was always my biggest one. It's funny. I used to think that I binged because I was tired, but when you connect the dots, you look at. I would always do it after I came back from a road trip from wrestling, but it wasn't because I was tired. I mean, being friggin' drop dead tired doesn't help, but it was because I was alone. I came home to an empty house, you know. I was in a town where I knew very few people in Tampa, and it ate me up. So I ate it up, and it makes, when you're binging, you think it's all going to be better. You feel, in that moment, you feel so much better. But the moment doesn't last. And that's what I told you guys in those other vlogs. No matter what you're feeling, no matter what has triggered you, remember, like I'll use myself as an example. After I ate all that food, my house was still empty. I was still alone, and I was still sad. Simple. So, I think it's Cliff Notes. Figure out what your biggest trigger is and do something about it. That's it. I'm not going to say that it's going to fix you in one step, but it's going to put you in the right direction for sure. So, double Cliff Note action. One, let's talk about trigger. We got trigger foods. Don't keep them in your house until you're fully recovered. Then we got the emotional triggers. Find out what your emotional trigger is and figure out ways to overcome it. Now, that's why the comment section is so great, because I want you guys to talk about your triggers. I want everybody to, that's your homework. I want you guys to talk about your triggers. Maybe they're the same as mine. Maybe they're different. And maybe let's start brainstorming. Let's figure out ways maybe we can overcome these triggers and feel a little bit better moving forward and try to overcome that. Because sometimes we can stop a binge in its tracks, but a lot of times, once you're triggered, it's hard to go back. So maybe just, I think being mindful of what makes us binge is really one of the biggest, most important steps for recovery. So, once again, guys, thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to reading your comments. Until next time, stay strong.
Let's go!